Thank you, and thank you to SAGES for putting on this program, because I think it is incredibly important, and I am very honored to be here. So I was assigned this topic, and it seemed very large. And then when I was doing my research for this, I realized that it's really just all about the money, and I felt like I was an economics graduate student. So I do not have any financial relationships to disclose. I'm going to be talking about some of the financial challenges of providing surgical care in low and middle income countries, how we can introduce some cost-saving measures in our own operating rooms, and review some surgical innovations which have been shown to be very safe, effective, and feasible, and then understand how these innovations can expand access to surgical care. So the most recent GDP per capita data is listed here, and you can see that in the United States, the average kind of amount of money per person is somewhere around $75,000 a year. And that drops off very quickly, and the vast majority of countries in the world are much, much lower. And so Zambia, which is a trip I just went on with ACS, their per capita GDP is $1,300 per year. And that is a very small amount of money. That is less than the cost of rent in most places for 1 month in the United States. And so, I've been thinking a lot about, how do we expand access to surgical care? Because when you're in Zambia, they literally don't have anything to operate with. And so they're like MacGyver over there. They are literally using things that are not intended to be used in that way to be able to operate on people. And this is how much things cost. And I actually have proprietary data from my hospital, and this is average amounts for a cost of equipment at my hospital. And an energy device is $500 to $600 to $700. A piece of mesh is $1,500 to $3,000, and then when you get into the expensive meshes, they can be $10,000 or $20,000. Even Dermabond is $20, which is a lot of money. The anti-fog system, which I complain about all the time because there's one I particularly like, is almost $75. And so I was very surprised at how much some of these things cost, but this is one of the primary reasons why most people in the world do not have access to care. My clicker is not great. Okay. And really, we are not good at understanding the economics of surgery. This was a survey of 100 surgeons who were shown 2 different instruments, and they were asked to pick which one was more expensive. And then they compared surgeons who had a cost report card, which is an initiative that a lot of hospitals have put into place to try and get surgeons to understand why they want to get rid of some things and add others because of the cost. And only 66% of the answers were correct, which just barely met statistical significance for being better than guessing. And so the one that almost everybody got correct was deciding whether an endoscopic stapler with a tissue load was more expensive than 2 endoloops, and they were correct. And so really, we are in a situation where surgeons do not understand how much we spend, and because of that, we waste a lot of money and energy and time and materials. So this was a study from Africa looking at the difficulty of African countries to have access to laparoscopic equipment, and especially with regard to both procurement and maintenance. And so in this study, they looked at, they surveyed, I think, I want to say about 30 surgeons. And sorry, my notes are underneath here, which I don't have access to. And 49% reported access to laparoscopic equipment at all. 100% had access to electrical surgical units, which would include bovie cautery. And 14% of these African surgeons reported reusing disposable electrosurgery devices, which they do in Zambia. They reuse bovies until they die and just re-sterilize them. And one of the biggest issues with surgical care is that a lot of the things we use in the operating room break. And when they break, we have reps who are there all the time, who come in, they take the broken thing away and give us a new one, and then they fix it and send it back. And so they don't have that in these countries. And so a lot of the items that we, try to donate or bring over, they end up breaking and never get used. And a lot of these equipment, one of the things in this paper that was really interesting is that places that had majority donated equipment had much less access to maintenance as opposed to the hospitals that were able to purchase themselves. So these are some of the barriers to minimally invasive surgery in Africa. And this was actually published ahead of print from last week in Surgical Endoscopy. And so high cost, obviously, of equipment, lack of access to consumables, which is things like mesh, stapler loads, clip reloads, all of those things. Lack of equipment, so graspers, laparoscopic scissors, ports, camera equipment, towers. Lack of access to CO2 is a really big problem in Africa. Unreliable electrical power supply is something that is really common in a lot of these countries. And you can imagine being in the middle of a lap chole and then your power goes out and everything is black. And that is not helpful. And so what can we do about this? As Plato said, necessity is the mother of invention. And because so many people in the world operate under these very restricted and limited conditions, a lot of people have actually come up with great ideas. And some people have called this reverse innovation, which is really kind of a negatively biased term that would imply that if a low-income country comes up with a good idea and then we adopt it, that somehow, it's not as good as if we came up with it ourselves. But I think a really good term for it is value innovation. So being able to come up with these low-cost innovations that can then disseminate worldwide. And the first kind of most famous one is called the Bogota bag. And this was a plastic bag that they sterilized and sewed to the fascia for a temporary abdominal closure. And this was done for the first time in 1984 in Bogota, Colombia, by a resident, Oswaldo Borges. And then it was published by a couple of US-based surgeons over the next few years, including Dr. Maddox. And it became famous worldwide and is now one of the many ways that we close temporary abdominal wounds. And it is extremely low cost and it's very effective. In terms of inguinal hernia repair, this is a very common problem worldwide, as everybody knows. And synthetic mesh, as I pointed out, is extremely expensive. And so there has been this movement to use mosquito netting as mesh, and it can be sterilized by putting it in a sterilization solution, which is usually glutaraldehyde. And this was a systematic review looking at over 1,000 patients who had inguinal hernia repair with mosquito mesh versus conventional commercial synthetic mesh. And the overall complication rate was 9%, but there was no difference between using the mosquito net mesh and using a commercially available synthetic. And Dr. McDonald is going to talk a little bit more about this. This is an interesting development from neurosurgery, and people have developed 3D printing and are using this polymethyl methacrylate, which is very low-cost, moldable synthetic polymer. And because 3D printing software has become open source in the last decade or so, now we can actually create our own implantable devices. And so this was a case series from Monterrey, Mexico, where they created their own calvarial implants and had no infection or any other complications, and their implant cost was only $135 to $400. And low-cost ventilators. So the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the biggest things that came out of this is that we actually can't take care of a lot of sick people, even in the United States or Canada, and that our hospital systems are easily overwhelmed in terms of crisis. And so out of the pandemic, it was noted that ventilators are a minimum of $50,000 a piece. They are extremely complex and have over 10,000 parts. So the FDA in the United States released an emergency use authorization for ventilators, and the Stanford group developed this O2U ventilator, which has a very limited number of components that can all be locally sourced. It only has 118 parts. A lot of the design of this is intended to be you can manually adjust things rather than needing high-tech complex sensors. And they were able to build this for a total cost of $1,000. There are some limitations to this device, but this is one of many really good ideas to come out of the COVID-19 pandemic. There are a bunch of studies out of India looking at gasless laparoscopic surgery. And essentially, you elevate the abdominal wall mechanically and do a laparoscopic operation without CO2 because CO2 is very hard to access in many countries. And so this was a systematic review looking at 63 papers, including 41 randomized controlled trials, and they had no difference in complications when compared to conventional laparoscopy. They did have a higher conversion rate to open for gynecologic procedures. The OR time was longer, but the length of stay was shorter for gasless laparoscopy versus open surgery. And then they did a recently published 3-day training program where they tested rural surgeons in India on FLS, MIS-TELS, which is a Canadian laparoscopic training assessment, and assess their competency to use this lift device. And they had a significant improvement in competency scores. And the cost was minimal at $400 per trainee. So this is, I thought, a really cool innovation that kind of gets around the access to CO2 problem. Looks like a really bad torture device from the Middle Ages, but pretty cool. And then this is a really interesting paper out of the Journal of Pediatric Surgery with this group from DC that developed a low-cost transportable laparoscopic surgery system. And so they developed, essentially it's a portable camera and endoscope with its own battery, and you just plug it into a computer. You do have to have an insufflating tower, unless I guess you're gonna use your abdominal lift device. But they were able to build this whole system for about $1,300 as compared to a standard Stryker laparoscopic system is about $8,000. So when your GDP per capita in Zambia is $1,300, it's much, much more affordable and accessible to have equipment like this that can be distributed widely. There are some considerations when we're looking at innovation for low-cost surgical equipment in terms of, is it ethical to use things if it's not quite as good? And are we assessing these equipments properly? Are we creating sustainable solutions? And then attribution. If someone has come up with a great idea and it gets published by a United States surgeon and then they get famous on it, is that fair or equitable? And then obviously partnerships, which is something that is really important in global surgery, is making sure that everything we do is a relationship and not, you know, us giving things to people to make ourselves feel good. You know, as Nia said, 5 billion people in this world do not have access to life-saving surgical care. And a very random plug is that I did my chief grand rounds on the Lancet Commission for Global Surgery. So if you have not read that paper and want an hour-long summary, you can actually just Google University of Wisconsin and my name, and it's publicly available. But that is where this data comes from, and I always am struck, one of the things that struck me the most about that report is that 75 million people die every year from appendicitis, which seems crazy. But this is what we're talking about. We're not talking about, you know, having some horrible problem that no one could ever fix. It's literally people dying from appendicitis and a broken leg and a wound infection. So we as a community, because we are part of the world, have an obligation to be cost aware and avoid unnecessary waste and share our resources. And I really think that it should be our mission with SAGES to work towards designing new low-cost innovations, helping to promote all of these developments, which are really cool, and helping to spread knowledge and access to surgery, especially minimally invasive surgery, to the entire world, to the benefit of billions of people. And so I would say that if any of this is exciting to you, these are things that we can do. And so the future of innovation is really up to us, and I think that we can make a huge impact. And I appreciate your time. Thank you.